Hello and welcome to part 5 in this series of answering your questions on worship, following on from the teaching series that we did recently on worship. And this question is about tongues. And do all tongues that are brought in a meeting or that we hear in a meeting, do they all need to be interpreted? Because on first read of 1 Corinthians 14, it would seem like the answer is surely, definitely, yes. Paul seems to be clear throughout. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. That the idea of being able to hear this spiritual language that nobody understands in the natural sense, and then it not being interpreted in a way that then everybody does understand, and then we're able to say amen, that seems to be exactly what Paul is going against in this chapter. But actually, I think there are a couple of places where we wouldn't have interpretation to someone hearing something in tongues. And the first is in verse 28, where Paul says, "But if there's no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in church and speak to himself and to God." And Paul seems to be saying, if you're not sure if someone's there that is able to interpret a tongue, which in our context, almost all of the time, there will be somebody there confident to give it a go. But Paul seems to be saying, look, use the gift, but just use it quietly under your breath so that you can be, as he says, it will build up yourself in the context of the gathered church, and it will be you communicating to God. And so God will hear it. And so I think there could be a context, and I've known this before, where someone is praying out where they are to God and for their own benefit in the gathered church, and you might be next to them, and you might hear them praying out in tongues, and they're doing exactly this. And they're not trying to bring something completely hearable and intelligible to everybody so that everybody's attention is on this person praying in tongues. And so then everybody's attention should then next be drawn to the interpretation of that tongue. But you as an individual, you're hearing them praying out in tongues, but it doesn't need an interpretation because the goal of it was not everybody hears. And there'd be a similar, I think the secondly would be in a very similar vein. Sometimes we will have times in our meeting where everybody is lifting up their voice as one. And we might be praying out in English, or you might be singing out in your mother tongue, or you might be praying in or singing in tongues. And we do that all as one voice. And I think that would be almost an extension of this, where everybody is just expressing their worship at once. And once again, the goal of that time is not everybody, all of us understanding a single contribution. So whether that would be in English, someone praying out, or whether it's someone praying out in tongues, the goal of that is not that everybody would be able to hear something, but that we are all just individually expressing our praise and worship together as one voice. And so again, you might hear somebody in that joint time, you might catch snippets of them praying out or singing out in tongues, but because they're not doing that in a way of, I want everybody to hear this, it's more just them adding their voice to the general chorus. And interpretation doesn't follow, because what Paul is really trying to get at here is he wants the general time of worship to be intelligible and understandable. And pragmatically and practically speaking, the reason that we often do the time of everybody lifting their voices up is because the reality is in our worship times, we don't have time to hear from literally every person that's there. And not everybody would feel confident to. And so as we lift our voices, it gives us a chance to kind of build that muscle and train ourselves in lifting up our voices and praying out loud and maybe singing in tongues and praying in tongues without the vulnerability of being the only person in that moment that's doing it. And I've found, and I'm sure other people have as well, that actually when we're doing that all together, whether it's praying out in English or praying in the gift of tongues, it helps me kind of formulate the beginnings of a contribution that I might then bring as the thing that everybody hears, as the noise all dies down. And so I think it can really help us kind of just start to formulate these things that can then be brought publicly. And so that's kind of the reason we do something like that. And that's why not every time that we hear someone praying out in the spiritual gift of tongues in our meetings, an interpretation always needs to follow. If a tongue is brought and it's clearly a public thing so that everybody hears it, and then an interpretation always does need to follow on from that. But in these couple of instances where that's not what's going on, we don't need an interpretation. I hope that's helpful. I hope that's clear. Feel free to send in any questions that you've got to follow on from that. If you'd like to, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much. See you next time.